4. Wild Hunt. "Curiouser and curiouser," said the doctor, intrigued. Sir Alexander stared at him. "Surely you don't believe that there's any connection between Tolliver's death and the stolen body?" The doctor rolled his eyes. "Unless this sleepy little town has suddenly developed a crime wave of epidemic proportions, we have to assume a connection." Doyle looked puzzled. "I can't see one." "Nor can I, yet," admitted the doctor. "What did this Mrs. Belliver die from?" "Purely natural causes," Dr. Martinson broke in hastily. "I myself was there when she expired. She was 87 years old and very frail. She died 3 nights ago before the Hope arrived." "So," Sir Alexander said gruffly, "there is no connection." "No," the doctor argued. "We simply haven't found one yet." He stared thoughtfully at the constable. "Is this the first time somebody dead has turned up missing?" When Faversham didn't answer immediately, the doctor turned to Sir Alexander. "Well, is it?" "There have been 2 other cases recently," the justice admitted carefully. "Then why didn't you say so?" the doctor snapped. I know, they didn't seem relevant." "Well, how recently?" "Just over 6 months ago and about 12 weeks ago." Sir Alexander looked a little crestfallen. "And when does the first missing child date back to?" asked the doctor, with all the patience he could muster. "Approximately the same length of time, sir," Faversham admitted. "I see." The doctor glared from the constable to his superior. "And you didn't see any connection?" "How could there be one?" argued Sir Alexander, reddening slightly. "How could there not be?" the doctor countered. "And all this began happening since your philanthropic Mr. Beckenridge arrived in town." "My dear doctor," exclaimed Dr. Martinson, "surely you are making too many inferences from too few facts." The doctor considered the point. "Perhaps I am," he agreed. "But that points to the need to gather more facts, doesn't it?" "We were working on the assumption," Sir Alexander said, "that resurrectionists were responsible for the missing bodies, and that it is entirely unrelated to the missing children." "Were you indeed?" asked the doctor. "This information changes everything, though. I had hoped that the children were alive, but if there are resurrectionists involved, isn't it possible that the missing children were murdered and used as a substitute form of bodies?" "Just a moment," argued Doyle. "I don't believe that resurrectionists could be involved here. For one thing, their foul trade hinges on their procuring fresh corpses for the teaching hospitals. There are no such hospitals within 100 miles of this place. The bodies would begin to decay long before they reached a hospital. Added to that, Mrs. Belliver died 3 days ago, so her body was hardly fresh in any event." "Capital reasoning, Doctor," said the doctor. "I couldn't have put it better myself." He turned to the constable. "I think you had better let us have a look at the scene of this fresh crime, don't you? Then we'll be able to deduce whether all these events are linked or separate." Sir Alexander glared at him. "I doubt that you'll find your hypothetical killer seals are responsible for digging up Mrs. Belliver." "Why don't we wait until we've had a chance to examine the site before making decisions?" snapped the doctor. He thrust his deerstalker back on his head. "Come along, doctors. Faversham, lead the way." The 3 schoolboys had been right in saying that Jen Walker was pretty. It was an unrefined prettiness, of course, since this was well out in the provinces, but she clearly had no lack of admirers as well as the boys. When Sarah found the barmaid, she was flirting gently with one of the local fisher lads. "Could we talk?" Sarah asked, giving the youth a pointed stare. "Off you go, Tom," Jen said, tossing her dark curls. "No doubt I'll be seeing you later this night." "For as much of it as you like," agreed Tom cheekily. "Be off with you," Jen laughed. Then she turned to Sarah. "And what would you like to talk about, miss?" she asked. "Schoolboys," Sarah replied. "Oh," Jen scowled. "I thought I'd seen Giga and his mates around earlier. Cheeky little buggers, aren't they? They've been giving you trouble too?" "None I can't handle," as Sarah informed her. "But they told me that you might have seen one of their friends." "You the sister of one of them come to complain?" she asked sharply. "I don't need no lip from the likes of you. Boys will be boys, and they have to learn their experiences somewhere." Sarah stared at the barmaid in disgust. "Look, I'm not here to get you into trouble," she snapped. "I'm looking for a missing boy, not for someone who seems to enjoy underage suitors. And I hope even you would draw the line at 10-year-olds. "Oh," Jen twitched her nose. "That missing kid Anders, you mean? Well, honest to God, I never seen him in my life." "He was on his way to see you when he vanished," Sarah replied. "Apparently, Giga and his chums talked up your charms and availability, and he wanted to become a man." "Well, he never did with me," Jen replied. "Strike me dead if I'm lying. I never saw the kid, and I wouldn't have done nothing if I had. I have me morals, you know." "Really?" asked Sarah sceptically. "I'll take your word for that. So you have no idea what might have happened to the boy then?" Jen's eyes narrowed. "Now, I didn't say that. I just said I didn't have anything to do with it. I might be able to help a little if you can make it worth me while. Get me drift?" She scratched at her palm. Sarah's blood was starting to boil. "I get your drift," she said, striving to keep her temper. "And if you aim to keep those good looks that bring in the customers, you'd better tell me what you know." She examined her nails thoughtfully. "I doubt you'd earn so much from even curious boys if you had scars down both cheeks." Realizing she'd gone too far, Jen backed away slightly. "I didn't mean nothing," she whined. "Just trying to make an honest living. You can't fault me for that, can you?" "Guess again," Sarah answered coldly. "You've got 10 seconds to say something I want to hear." "Like I said," Jen answered hastily, "I don't know nothing myself. But you should talk to Billy. He knows everything that happens in the village." "Billy?" "Yeah, he's one of the wharf rats, you know." Jen pointed down to the shore. "He's got a little lean-to by the docks. There's a house down there with a red roof and door. Past that, down the shore a bit, is where Billy lives. Tell him I sent you, and he'll talk to you. I bet he knows something." "Something he wouldn't tell the police, you mean?" asked Sarah. "Police?" snorted Jen. "Billy wouldn't have nothing to do with the police. Better sense than that Billy's got. But you speak to him." Sarah nodded and left the tavern. As she dreaded, Kipling and his 2 pals were eagerly awaiting for her. "Learn anything?" Beresford asked. "More than you have in years of schooling," Sarah told him. "If I find out what happened to Anders, I'll let you know. Now buzz off." "Never," said Kipling defiantly. "We're here to offer you our protection and assistance." "And crude comments too," Sarah retorted. "I don't need any of them. Clear off." Kipling's face fell. "Oh, come on," he begged. "He's our responsibility, you know. Well, McBee's at least. And we could be useful, couldn't we?" He gave her a pathetic look of hope. Against her better judgment, Sarah took pity on them. "Oh, all right," she agreed crossly. "But one untoward comment from any of you, and I'm sending you back to school with a flea in your ears. And don't think I wouldn't." "Honestly," Dunsterville assured her, "we believe every last word you say, Miss Smith." "Now you're starting to learn," Sarah approved. "I can quite understand your concern, Alice," Bridewell told her, holding her hand comfortingly. "I will confess, what you overheard does sound rather bad for Edmund." "Bad?" Alice stared at her fiancé. "He's planning to rob this house, Roger. That manservant of his is a common thief." "Alice," Roger said, his face twisted by indecision, "please trust me. I know it looks bad, but please believe me. I know that Edmund is planning nothing that would hurt you in any way, despite what you heard." "Then tell me what he is planning, if you know," begged Alice. "I can't," Roger replied, not looking at her. But if you love me, Alice, trust me on this matter." Alice was torn. She did love him, but he was asking a great deal of her. His explanations, if they were in fact explanations and not evasions, were not making her feel any better. "Roger, I want to trust you, but I can't trust him without some reason." Roger nodded miserably. "I shall have a word with Edmund," he promised. "Perhaps that will help." "Perhaps," agreed Alice, unconvinced. Roger kissed her hand rather perfunctorily, and then fled down the corridor. She stared after him, wondering how well she really knew her fiancé. He was certainly keeping some secret about Edmund from her. But what? What kind of a hold did the suave Colonel Ross have over Roger? Friendship? Money? Blackmail? She didn't know, and if Roger wouldn't confide in her, then perhaps she'd better do a little prying of her own. She was not about to trust Ross without some convincing proof of the innocence of his intentions, and Roger was about to warn the man of her suspicions. Making up her mind, she headed for Ross's rooms. She felt dreadful about searching them, but what else could she do? Perhaps something would be revealed to resolve her quandary. The graveyard was small and set on one of the hills overlooking Bodden Bay. An ancient, weather-beaten stone church guarded the high spot on the rise. The tower was definitely Saxon in styling and in need of a little work, and the windows in the grey stonework were small. The graves were gathered about the church as if seeking the protection of those old stones. Most were marked with simple headstones, many of which had been worn into virtual unreadability. There had been some efforts to tend the graves, but several were overgrown with patchy clumps of unkempt grass. Against the grey sky, the whole sight looked dreadfully depressing to Doyle. Faversham led the way across the graveyard as the harsh winds tugged at their coats. The doctor, hands thrust in his pockets, his face inscrutable, followed. Behind Doyle, limping slightly, came Sir Alexander and Dr. Martinson. The policeman halted beside a dark gash in the ground. The gravestone had been knocked over, and a hole dug straight through the fresh earth. The doctor peered in the gap, and Doyle stared down over his shoulder. The coffin was still down there, a simple wooden affair of local timber. The top had been staved in by a spade, and the body had been dragged out through the gap. A piece of the shroud had caught on a long splinter of wood in the coffin lid and flapped like a trapped butterfly, vainly striving to escape. The doctor looked up, his face grim. "Stay back," he called over his shoulder to Martinson and Sir Alexander. He glanced at Faversham and Doyle. "Both of you stay where you are," he said. Without explanation, he went down on one knee and began to stare at the ground around the grave. Doyle stared at him in fascination. "What are you doing, Doctor?" he asked. "Looking for clues," he snapped. "Be quiet." He sprang to his feet and wandered across the grounds, staring intently at the ground. Making his way back to the small stone wall surrounding the church, he examined the top stones, and then walked slowly back to the grave. "There were two men," he announced. "One was tall and heavy-set, the other shorter and thin. They came from the village and went back that way with the corpse." Doyle was astonished. "How on earth could you possibly know that?" The doctor cracked one of his wide, toothy smiles. "Elementary, my dear Doyle." He pointed to the ground. "Aside from a set of woman's shoe prints that I assume to be the cleaner who discovered the robbery, there are two recent sets of shoe prints. One is a large size and sinks deeply into the disturbed fresh earth, hence a large man, and rather heavy. The other set is small and not as deep, a smaller, lighter man. The same prints show on the pathway from the village at the gate, and they return that way also. On the return trip, the large man's prints sink even deeper, so he was carrying the woman's corpse with him. "That's remarkable!" exclaimed Sir Alexander. "And can you tell us where the men went in the village?" The doctor shook his head. "The ground is too rocky, and by the time we get down to the village, the cobblestone streets will not carry prints. This is all I can tell you for the moment, gentlemen, but the culprits must still be somewhere in the vicinity." "That's quite astounding," Doyle enthused. "Scientific method," the doctor answered. "Now, we have several separate mysteries that I feel certain must be intertwined. You know what we need now?" "What?" asked Doyle. "Lunch. I'm starving. Come on." The doctor rubbed his hands together and started back towards the village. "You've left me in the deuce of an uncomfortable position, old man," Roger complained. "I know I promised to help all I could, but with Alice getting suspicious—" "I know, Roger, and I'm sorry. I suppose the best thing to do would be for me either to leave or come clean. But I'm so close now, I know it. I'm fairly certain that what I'm after isn't here at all." "Which I told you from the start," Roger pointed out. "I know you did," agreed Ross. "But you know I couldn't simply take your word for it. Now I have Abercrombie checking out other possibilities. The problem is that matters have become rather more complex than I had anticipated. This doctor fellow, for example, he's a factor I hadn't foreseen, and I'm not at all certain whose side he's on, or what his reasons are for getting involved with this in the first place. Then there's that whaling ship, the Hope. It can't be a coincidence that it was diverted here at this time, but how does it figure in? Will it interfere with my plans?" Ross sighed. "I had anticipated a fairly straightforward time here, but it's definitely far too complex now. Still, that's my problem, and I shall have to make the best of it." "Then what do you aim to do?" asked Roger. His friend patted his arm in a kindly fashion. "What I don't aim to do is to come between you and your fiancée, old man. I promise you. I'll square things out with her somehow. I just have to work out what would be best." Roger smiled with relief. "Thanks. I'd certainly appreciate your getting me off the hook with Alice." The room that Ross had been given was in the west wing. Alice slipped inside it and gazed around. It was a simple bedroom, with little adornment other than a few paintings on the wall. There were 2 large trunks positioned beside the chest of drawers, one of which was unstrapped. Both trunks were covered with small stickers. Alice took a closer look and saw that they were paste-on labels from hotels all around the world: Cairo, Cadiz, San Francisco, Panama, Rio de Janeiro. Obviously Edmund Ross, or at least his luggage, was well-travelled. Feeling a twinge of guilt, Alice used the straps to open the unlocked trunk. As she did so, she felt a slight prick in the end of her finger. She winced, and then saw a drop of blood forming. Some kind of needle in the strap must have... She felt herself growing rather heady. She gasped and tried to straighten up, but her legs refused to obey her, and she couldn't stand. Her knees gave way, and with a sigh she collapsed to the floor, unconscious. A few moments later, Ross strode into the room. He stopped in his tracks and stared in despair at the girl on the floor. "Oh dear," he sighed. "This does complicate matters rather more." It was certainly not turning out to be one of his better days. Sarah led Kipling, Dunsterville and Beresford to the small lean-to shack that the barmaid had described. It was even flimsier and filthier than Sarah had been expecting, and it was hard to imagine that anyone actually lived here. The wind was rising now, whipping at any exposed portions of Sarah's skin. She could imagine what it would be like here in the winter, and was astounded that the rickety little hut managed to survive those months. As the 4 of them approached the dwelling, there was a sudden movement. A small girl, dressed in dark clothing that flapped raggedly, seemed to flash from behind a rock on the sea-walk and into the hut. A lookout, obviously, probably gone to warn whoever else lived in the hut that visitors were coming. "Right," she said firmly to her companions. "You three stay here." "We want to help," Kipling objected. "As far as these kids are concerned," Sarah pointed out, "you're rich brats. They won't trust you." "And will they trust you?" asked Bereford scornfully. "They might," Sarah answered. She had been wondering the same thing herself. These wharf rats had never been treated as anything other than vermin in their lives. Would they even want to talk to her? "I'm going to try. So stay put and stay out of trouble." She ignored Kipling and his friends and marched on down the quay towards the hut. The door opened as she drew close, and a tall, thin boy stepped out. He was obviously underfed, and his clothing was tattered and didn't fit at all well. His dark eyes were haunted and angry, and he ran thin fingers through dusty blonde hair that had probably only been washed if he had fallen into the ocean. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was cold, angry, and impatient. "You ain't welcome, you know." "I only want to talk, Billy," Sarah said, pitching her voice low and warm. "I think we may have a problem in common." Billy laughed sharply. "You and me?" he snorted. "Get on. We got nowt in common." "Missing children," Sarah said. That made his eyes narrow. His right hand came up, and Sarah saw that he held a fish-gutting knife at the ready. Unlike Billy, the knife was clean and obviously well used. She suspected that Billy had used it to defend himself many times in the past. "What do you mean?" he growled suspiciously. "Those three boys," Sarah waved vaguely in Kipling's direction. Billy's eyes flickered off her face only for a second, and then returned. "One of their friends has gone missing. I talked to Jen Walker, and she said that some of your friends have gone missing too, and she said that you might be able to help me find them." "She says too much," Billy complained. "She shouldn't talk so much." Sarah smiled. "Maybe, Billy. But have some of your friends disappeared too?" "What do you care?" asked Billy. "They're just street rats. Nobody cares about they, except I." "I care," Sarah told him. "Whatever they are, they're human beings. I know the police don't care much, but I promise you that they matter to me." "You're just saying that," the boy retorted angrily. "You're like the rest, want us gone. Why should I trust you?" Sarah shrugged. "No reason at all, Billy. I can't prove that I care or that I'm telling the truth. But unless you give me a chance, you'll never know, will you?" Was she getting through to him at all? He had obviously lived on the streets and off his wits almost all his young life. Suspicion and fear were his constant companions. Could she possibly break through those barriers and reach him? "All I'm asking for is a little help from you so that I can help you in return." "We don't need your help," he answered, brandishing the knife. "We look after ourselves." "You do need help," Sarah countered, "because some of your friends have disappeared, haven't they? And you haven't been able to stop it. Well, maybe I can, if I have some idea where to start looking." Billy thought hard for a moment. Sarah stayed silent, knowing this was a battle he'd be waging with himself, and that anything else she said now might swing him the wrong way. It would not be an easy matter for him to trust her, but had she made him realise that he had no other genuine option? "No skin off my nose," he finally announced ambiguously. "If you get yourself killed," he added. "Then you do have some idea what may have happened to the missing children?" asked Sarah. He shrugged. "No," he answered, dashing her hopes. "But I know who might. Factory man." Sarah started to feel hopeful once again. "Factory man?" she asked. Billy gestured with the knife. "Go see him," he suggested. "Look hard. Now just go." Knowing she'd get no more this time, Sarah nodded. "All right, Billy. Thank you for your help. I promise I will do my best to find your friends too. I'll let you know if I find anything out." "Don't do me favours," Billy snapped. But he looked at least part-way pleased at her response. Returning to Kipling and his companions, Sarah asked, "What do you know about a factory man?" Kipling scowled. "You must mean old Breckenridge. He owns a factory on the outskirts of Bodham. You must have seen it as you came into town. Big, modern and very impressive. He's really into progress and what have you. Shame he's such an unpleasant fellow, though. Does the fish boy think that Breckers has something to do with Anders' disappearance? Asked Berriford. Billy does, Sarah said, stressing the youngster's name. And with a few others too. Can't think why he'd want to, Dunstable said. He's a mean sort, but not such a bad egg. Maybe he's a worse egg than you think, Sarah told him. Why don't we go and see if we can have a chat with him? I'm game, agreed Kipling. I'll be scout. He set off down the road. Sarah followed behind, ignoring Berriford's comments as he droned away. She couldn't help wondering whether Dunsterville had a point. Why would a successful factory owner be connected to missing children? Was it possible that Billy was sending her on a wild goose chase just to get rid of her? As the doctor reached the Pig and Thistle, he halted and turned to Sir Alexander. "Why don't you and Dr. Martinson order up some lunch?" he suggested. "I'd like to see if Captain Grey is back on the Hope yet. I've an idea that he may be able to clear up a few items that are nagging at the back of my mind. If he's not back yet, Doyle can leave him a note to get in contact with us when he does return." "Oh, very well," the magistrate agreed. "Though I still think you're off hunting red herrings, Doctor." The doctor grinned. "I've a particular fondness for herrings," he replied. "Come on, Doyle." He started down the wharf towards where the Hope lay at anchor. "Do you think I'm off on a tangent here also?" Doyle shrugged. "I have to admit, Doctor, that it does look like you're connecting matters that are unrelated. On the other hand, your scientific methods are impeccable, and you are certainly skilled at deduction. I'm willing to indulge a few wild ideas if they help to settle this case." He rubbed his hands together eagerly. "And it certainly is proving to be a most fascinating affair, isn't it?" "It would be more fascinating," the doctor replied, "if people weren't dying. But it is unique." They had reached the plank leading up to the whaler now. "After you, my dear chap." "Thank you." Doyle led the way aboard. There was no one in sight on deck, and Doyle gestured. "The captain's quarters are over here," he said. "Where is everyone?" the doctor asked. "Shore leave," Doyle informed him. "The captain gave us a day or so off while he concluded his deal. Then the ship will head back home. I imagine most of the crew are off getting blind drunk while they can." The doctor nodded. It sounded more than reasonable. They reached the door to the captain's cabin, and Doyle rapped on it. The door swung slowly open. "Odd," Doyle muttered. "This is usually kept locked." If there was a sudden flurry of movement, and a hunched form shot out of the cabin, slamming into Doyle and knocking the medical man backward with a whoosh of breath. Doyle slammed into the doctor, and they collapsed in a tangle of arms and legs. It took Doyle a moment to catch his breath and stagger back to his feet. "The scoundrel's getting away," he wheezed, clutching his stomach with one hand and the wall of the cabin with the other. "Got away," corrected the doctor, regaining his own feet. "I doubt either of us could catch up with him now. Besides, I know where I can find him anyway." "You do?" asked Doyle, his face returning to its normal colour and his breathing regular once more. "You recognise the man, then?" "Yes," the doctor said. "I only saw him briefly last night, but there's no mistaking that nose and build. His name is Abercrombie, and he works for a Colonel Ross." Frowning, Doyle followed the doctor into Gray's cabin. "He must have been here to rob the captain," he said. "We'd better let Faversham know so he can arrest the villain." "Not yet," the doctor cautioned. "I'd like to know what he expected to find in here that's worth his while. Men who spend many months in the Arctic don't usually take many valuables with them, do they? If Gray is off ship, he's not likely to leave much cash around either." "True," agreed Doyle, puzzled. "We won't really get any money till we dock again in Peterhead and sell the bulk of the cargo." He glanced around the cabin. "Not much has been disturbed," he observed. "Except this." the doctor answered. He gestured to the ship's log, which was open on the captain's desk. To today's entries, in fact. He scanned the page. Hullo! Now that is interesting. What? Doyle peered over the doctor's shoulder. Met with Beckinridge and Ross, the doctor read. He grinned. That was yesterday, he said thoughtfully. Beckinridge again. He seems to be turning up at every twist in the road, doesn't he? And I wonder why your captain met with this mysterious Colonel Ross. And why was Ross's man here reading that? Doyle asked, perplexed. Unless maybe he aimed to destroy the reference so we couldn't read it. The doctor snorted. Come on, Doyle. We wouldn't have even looked at it if Abercrombie hadn't left the page open. He shook his head. Another mystery. Doyle sighed. It seems as if at every turn matters get more complex and confusing, he complained. I know, agreed the doctor happily. Isn't it fun? Right. Leave Gray a note asking him to contact us as soon as he can, and let's be going. I'm famished. There it is, said Kipling. Sarah couldn't help noticing a distinct trace of pride in his voice. She remembered that he was very keen on progress and had even written a couple of science fiction stories as a young writer. Breckinridge's factory. It looked like one of Blake's dark satanic mills to Sarah. It was large, block-shaped, and grim. 3 tall chimneys were pouring thick, gritty fumes into the atmosphere. There were few windows visible in the walls, and the entire bottom half of the building was invisible behind a tall stone wall. A single road led to the structure, and the sound of machinery came from within, audible even at this distance of about a mile. So, what does he make? She asked, as they strode along briskly. She was glad that she had had a good breakfast and a rest before all this marching around. Bodham was only a small town, but it seemed as if everything she wanted to see was at opposite ends of it. The factory was on a small hill to the west of town, facing out into the bay. She could make out a pipe that led from the base of the hill and which was discharging into the sea. Pollutants, no doubt. A jolly good living, Kipling answered, grinning. Aside from that, wire and cables, I believe. Wire and cables? Sarah was puzzled. Isn't this a trifle out of the way for such things? I would expect the market for them to be closer to London. Kipling shook his head. Ah, but Breckinridge is a great believer in progress. He's talking about laying a telegraph line between England and the United States that would carry 10 times the load of the ones Lord Kelvin laid 15 years ago. And if that was done, Sarah said, catching on, he'd be able to supply the necessary materials from here instead of having to ship them out from London. Clever. Rather, agreed Kipling. This man has an eye on the future, no doubt about that, and he's very interested in the telephone. He came to our school last term and gave a talk about it being the future of communications, and even envisions a time when telephonic lines will cross the Atlantic and replace telegraphs. It's jolly interesting stuff. Of course. This was 1880, and it was only a year since Bell had demonstrated the telephone to Queen Victoria. The great explosive growth of this new industry was poised to start. Breckinridge was definitely being visionary if he was already planning to take advantage of that new technology to lay submarine cables for it. Then why had she never heard of his name in that connection? He was certainly in the right place at the right time with the right product. Why hadn't he been one of the first media barons then? Did his failure have something to do with the events that were unfolding? It was lucky that the TARDIS had brought them here then, instead of meeting up with Kipling in 10 years' time in India. Or was it luck? Too often, Sarah reflected, the ship had landed her and the Doctor right in the thick of things. Could it be nothing more than coincidence? Or was it possible that the TARDIS, or some other force unknown as yet, was deliberately bringing the Doctor to points in space and time where help was needed. As she mused on this thought, they drew closer to the factory. There was a definite odour in the air now. All factories seemed to be intent on producing stench as a primary product, she reflected. There was a small guard box beside the door, and a bored-looking rat-faced man inside it. He glared at the four of them as they approached, as if irritated that they should deign to disturb his rest. "I'd like to see Mr. Breckinridge, please," Sarah said firmly. "Sorry," the guard replied. "He's not available for visitors." That wasn't a very encouraging start. "When will he be back, then?" Ratface sniggered. "Did I say he was out? I just told you he's not seeing visitors." He was clearly enjoying his role as guardian of the gates. Sarah examined the gates carefully. There was no way through them without the man's permission, that was clear, and it didn't look as if he was interested in letting anyone pass. "I'd prefer to hear Mr. Breckinridge say that himself," she snapped. "Can you take a message to him?" "I'm a guard, not a messenger," the man replied haughtily. "I guard. I don't carry messages, and I was told point blank not to let in visitors." "Really?" Sarah glowered at him. "Have you turned many others away today?" "No." "You're the first. Goodbye." "It's a waste of time," Beresford said. "Why don't we just go somewhere more interesting?" Sarah shrugged. For once, she was inclined to agree with Beresford, but she wasn't going without firing off one last salvo. "Well, tell Mr. Breckinridge that I was here, please. The name is Sarah Jane Smith, and I'm staying with Sir Edward Fulbright. You could mention that I was asking about missing children." Ratface scowled at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. Sarah smiled sweetly. "If you were a messenger and not a guard, I might explain. Bye." She waved and started back towards the village. Let's see what effect that produces, she mused. If any, of course. Her 3 musketeers promptly fell in beside her. She'd have felt better about them if they weren't continually staring at her ankles or her chest. She knew she had their attention only because they were hoping to take advantage of her later. That chance, she thought. She gave a start as Billy suddenly stepped out into the road ahead of them. He'd been behind a tree, and Kipling and his friends yelped and almost jumped out of their skins. Billy sneered at them. "I can see why you need my help," he told Sarah. "Brave as rabbits, they is." Beresford stepped forward. "You want a serious duffing up," he growled. Billy produced his knife, and Beresford retreated again. Giving a crooked grin, Billy winked at Sarah. "I followed along to make sure you were on the level," he explained. "You really are looking for the missing uns, aren't ye?" "Yes," Sarah agreed. She was starting to quite like this little hoodlum. For one thing, she liked the subduing effect he had on Kipling and company. "But I didn't get very far, did I?" "Didn't think Factory Man would hand them over, did ye?" "No," admitted Sarah. "But I would have liked the chance to meet this Breckinridge. I've got good instincts and the nose of a reporter. If he tried to cover up anything, I'd know." "I like ye," Billy said. He stuck out a filthy hand. "I'll help ye." Wondering how many diseases she was risking, Sarah shook his hand gingerly. "Thanks, Billy. But help me how?" "Me mates will look and listen," he promised. "Anything turns up, I'll fetch ye. You've me word on it." "You wouldn't trust a tramp like that, would you?" asked Dunsterville in disgust. "I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him." "You want to throw me?" Billy asked slyly. "You can try." "There's no need to fight," Sarah told them all firmly. "Yes, I do trust Billy. On his own, there's not much he can do. Joining forces with us makes us all stronger." She turned to the beggar boy. "You can find me. I can find ye when I want," Billy said, sniffing loudly in disdain. "Don't need no map." He tossed her a ragged salute and dived off the road into the trees again. Within seconds, there was neither sight nor sound of him. "Interesting character," said Sarah. She was most amused by the look of disgust and irritation on the faces of the 3 boys left with her. They all knew they had been outdone, and by a boy they felt utter contempt for. "Cheer up," she told them. "Maybe you'll actually be of some use later." The looks on their faces almost made up for the troubles she'd endured at their hands so far. It was starting to shape up into a fine day after all. Still, where was she actually getting? She'd really discovered nothing of much use, and her only gains thus far were to have 3 schoolboys and 1 dropout join her side. She could only hope that the doctor was having more luck. Ross could only hope that Abercrombie was having more luck than he was. He had managed to carry Alice back to her own room unobserved and quickly checked that his booby trap hadn't caused any serious medical condition. She would wake up when his little drug wore off in a couple of hours, but he wasn't expecting her to have no clue as to what had happened to her. When she awoke, there was going to be trouble. He couldn't afford to wait around for that. It was bad enough that she suspected his motives, and that her father was so implacable in his own suspicions. Now she finally had some proof for her theory that Ross was up to no good. After all, why would a man with nothing to hide set traps on his luggage for the unwary? There was no option but for him to leave before she awoke. He couldn't possibly get out of here with all his luggage for the moment, which meant leaving it until later. On the other hand, he doubted that anyone else would be foolish enough to try and open it, given Alice's experience, so it should be safe enough for now. If only there had been some sign of what she was after. Carefully removing several items from his locked trunk, Ross reset the traps and then locked the case again. He slipped the items into his pockets, save for the rifle case. That he would have to carry. He glanced at his watch and frowned. Abercrombie should have been back by now if everything had gone well. That suggested another problem. Just what he needed. Why couldn't this whole thing have worked as smoothly as most of his jobs? He eased open the door to his room and carefully scanned the corridor outside. There was no sign of any of the servants, so he slipped out. Staying close to the wall and poised to hide if necessary, he made his way to the stairs leading to the rear exit of the hall. There he paused, hearing the soft sound of movement on the stairs. He glanced around and then moved to the closest door. It was locked, but to his skeleton keys that was no bar. He moved into the room and closed the door almost entirely, leaving the barest crack to peer through. The room was an unmade guest room, and smelled vaguely fusty. He stiffened as there came the sound of someone entering the corridor, and then breathed a sigh of relief. It was Abercrombie, trying to sneak into the hall unobserved as he'd been instructed. As Abercrombie passed the room, Ross opened the door and tapped his companion on the shoulder. Abercrombie squealed and jumped, then spun about so fast he almost fell over. "Stand the crows," he complained, seeing who it was. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" "Yes," admitted Ross. "About face, we have to leave immediately." "How come?" "Miss Fulbright attempted to open my luggage," Ross answered, waving the little man back towards the stairwell. "Bloomin' Ada," Abercrombie muttered, scuttling back down the stairs. "That's torn it." "It has indeed," agreed Ross. "We'd better lay low until this evening." He hefted the wooden case he was carrying. "I've brought the Townsend." Abercrombie made a face. "You going to have to use it?" Ross sighed. "I doubt I'll have any option but to kill," he replied. They had reached the base of the stairs. Beyond was a door to the servants' quarters, and he could hear sounds of activity and voices through there, but this side was clear. He led the way out to the rear of the hall and then sprinted for the closest trees. A moment later, Abercrombie joined him. "Until this evening, we'd better lay low," he said. "Meanwhile, how did your research fare?" "Good and bad," his companion answered sourly. "Did you bring any food?" "I'm famished." "No, there was no time." About your findings." Abercrombie scowled at the news, and then smiled as he delivered his own. "He's here," he reported, "at the factory." "Excellent," Ross replied. "Typical, isn't it? Only 2 possible locations, and I selected the wrong one." Abercrombie shrugged. "Can't win 'em all," he opined. "So, do we go down to break in now?" "Not just yet," Ross replied. "First things first. The factory can wait until the morning, I think." "What about my stomach?" asked Abercrombie, rubbing it as he spoke. "I need food to keep going." "We could try getting a bite to eat at the local tavern," Ross suggested. "That might not be such a great idea," his companion replied. "That doctor bloke and another geezer spotted me on the ship." Ross gave him a severe look. "You're slipping up. But you're right. We'd best not go back to the village, in case they arrest you." Abercrombie looked wistful. "Yeah, but they'd feed me." With a deep, mournful sigh, he followed Ross into the woods. "Maybe we can find you some nuts," Ross suggested with a smile. "Do I look like a ruddy squirrel?" Sarah was just getting her appetite when they arrived back at the tavern. There had been no sign of the doctor or his companions at the barn, and even the body of old Ben Tolliver had vanished. Since the carriage was still waiting, Sarah realised the doctor was probably still investigating. As it was past noon, the tavern was open, and several of the locals were already inside, pints and pipes in hand and mouth. Jen Walker was there, collecting and refilling glasses. She nodded at the back room. "Your mate's in there," she said, "tucking into a pie." "What a marvellous idea," said Kipling loudly. "Come on," Sarah said, realising she was unlikely to be rid of her 3 shadows for a while. She crossed the smoke-filled lounge and moved into the slightly less smoky air of what passed for a dining room. As the barmaid had said, the doctor was there, cheerfully eating a large wedge of some kind of local pie. Sir Alexander's and Doctors Doyle and Martinson were also enjoying a meal and a glass of wine. "Ah, there you are," the doctor called out. "And your cheering section too." He gestured at the empty seats about the large table. "Make yourselves comfortable." "Absolutely," said Kipling, snatching up a spare plate and cutting himself a large chunk of the steaming pie. His 2 friends followed suit and settled down to stuff their faces. It was a good thing Sarah hadn't really been expecting better manners of them. She helped herself to a smaller piece of pie and sat beside the doctor. "So," she asked conversationally, "how was your morning?" Doyle passed her a glass of white wine, which she accepted gratefully. The pie was delicious, and as she ate, she listened to the doctor and Doyle recounting their findings. Then she told them of her own escapades. "You've done well as always," the doctor said approvingly, as he cleaned his own plate. "Smart move to win over young Billy like that." Doyle frowned. "I think it's dashed irregular to use young urchins as agents," he complained. "But very wise," the doctor countered. "People are used to seeing them about, and they can go places and listen in where an adult would be immediately suspected as a spy. And from the sound of things, young Billy is likely to turn up any amount of helpful information." "What concerns me, though," Sir Alexander interjected, "is all this stress you're laying on poor old Breckinridge. The man's merely a businessman who's helped out the village when he didn't have to. I feel certain that he's innocent of involvement." "He may be," agreed Sarah, "but unless we can check him out, we won't know for certain." She gave the magistrate a winning smile. "You know him. Can't you arrange for him to allow us to visit the factory?" Sir Alexander flushed slightly, obviously appreciating her attention. "I can but try, young lady. When I get home later, I'll send a man around to ask." The doctor nodded. "We'll assume that Breckinridge agrees," he commented. "That means tomorrow at the soonest will be a visit to the factory." "Is that a problem?" "No," the doctor gave another of his wide smiles. After all, tonight we go out hunting the beast of the moors. He smiled at Doyle. Are you up to that, do you think? Doyle nodded eagerly. Wouldn't miss it for the world, he announced. The game's afoot.